Thank you for tuning in to ICT on PNC, a podcast covering issues that impact the Texas insurance industry. The Insurance Council of Texas is a nonprofit trade association serving the property and casualty insurance industry. We're proud to be the largest state-based insurance trade association in North America. Welcome to ICT on PNC.
Hello, I'm Albert Betts, Executive Director of the Insurance Council of Texas. Thank you for joining us for our podcast. Joining me today is Angie Cervantes. Hi, Angie.
Hi.
Angie's our Manager of Government and Legislative Affairs. And also with us is our newest ICT member, Rich Johnson, Director of Communications and Public Affairs. Hi, Rich.
Hi, how are you? Glad to be here.
Rich has been with us since September of last year. So he's a veteran of ICT at this point, but he's going to join us today for a look back at 2021 and a look forward at what 2022 has to hold. I know my first thought about 2021 is, as we sat here about a year ago and thought, thank God we got through 2020, 2021 immediately said, hold my beer, because it had its own twists and turns and interesting events. We'll cover some of that today with you. Talk about what happened, what was impactful to the Texas PNC marketplace, some national issues as well, and then so speculation. The crystal ball will come out and we'll start thinking about what does 2022 have to hold for us and for the Texas industry. We hope to bat at least 50-50 on that, but we'll see. And so I think it'll be a good conversation. And let's start by, actually, we'll go back to late 2020 because you can't talk about 2021 without leading into where we were January 1, 2021. The November 2020 elections had happened. In Texas, at least, heading into those elections, there was a strong thought that we might have a switch in the composition of the Texas House. Democrats were confident at least of picking up at times numbers maybe as high as 10 House of Representatives seats. In the end, the House pretty much stayed the same, 83 Republican reps and 67 Democrats. We had some changes in the Senate, but nothing significant. And we had a new Speaker of the House, who was a coastal rep, Speaker Phelan. And so we knew we were going to have some changes in the Texas legislature coming into 2021. Particularly with the committee chairs, those are the folks who run the committees that deal with various issues and specifically for property and casualty insurance. But we also saw with the national election change, a change in leadership at the federal level. So 2021, I'm not going to go into great detail, but we saw the events of January 6th. We saw a new president inaugurated, and we saw the legislature kick off. And coming into session, after the events of 2020, we pretty much knew, Angie, kind of where the legislature would head in terms of what were their 4 or 5 priorities. Let's talk a bit about what the legislature identified in priorities, and then how property and casualty insurance fit into those statewide issues.
Right. They right off the bat, we knew that things such as guns, open constitutional carry, abortion, voting, election reform were some of the issues that were going to dominate and color the session. Governor Abbott, as he does every session, lays out priorities and what he identifies as priorities for the beginning of the session. And it was no surprise that he identified these issues, and that was right at the beginning. And then things also changed and priorities changed as we got hit by the winter storm in February, which was relatively early in the session. And so a lot of the priorities shifted to addressing the storm and ERCOT and the PUC.
Yeah, we had enough going on with COVID. I remember going into the Capitol for a hearing early on about the storm, but having to take the COVID test to enter the building. You had masks in the building. Some committees were meeting with sparse crowds. Depending on which legislative office you visited, you could go in, and other offices were not accepting visitors. And so there's a lot of concern about making sure we didn't spread the disease. I know we had some members who did ultimately come down with it. But yeah, February 11th is what I recall as the date sitting here watching the roads freeze up in Fort Worth, Dallas, Fort Worth. And you may remember that huge auto pileup up there, unfortunately, that cost 10 or 11 lives and millions of dollars in accidents and losses. But that took over the session. Texas had its last big winter storm, as I recall, I think in 2011, but nothing like this. All 254 counties covered in ice. The power outages. Not going to spend too much time recapping my own personal issues, but I know we all did without power and water. I know you spent some time, as I'll say, roaming around downtown Austin trying to find a place to stay and find some heat. So
food and shelter,
food and shelter and heat became very important. And we realized or were reminded Texas is not really equipped to deal with such bitter cold. But the downside of that is so many Texans get without power that we ended up with significant numbers of damage across homes and businesses. And I think the last thing we saw from the Department of Insurance was at least 500,000 claims were filed as a result of that winter storm. And it's estimated it's going to cost over $10 billion in insured losses. And about $3 billion of that will be paid by reinsurance. So a significant disaster and tragedy for many Texans. We had many who lost their lives in this storm. But in addition, also a significant insurance event and a lesson for us about how we prepare going forward. I know your background includes a little bit on, not a little bit, but a lot on ERCOT and energy in Texas. You want to comment a bit about how that played out during the legislative session?
Right. During the legislative session, we saw a lot of focus going on what could ERCOT have done to keep the lights on, and because ERCOT is, I guess, the air traffic control is a good way to put it of Texas utilities, because we're deregulated as far as the industry, so they don't provide the generation or anything like that, but they're in charge of working with all the characters and saying how much do we need and how much are we going to supply. And so given that role, and they handle the grid, which Texas has its own independent grid, which is pretty unique. And then I think that the downside of that is that we're not connected to another grid. So when we were in desperate need of power, we didn't have anywhere to get it from. So that the shift in focus really in the legislature was on ERCOT. What can ERCOT do to where did the problem happen, and how can we address it and how can we fix it? So I think that we got a little bit on the insurance side. We would never have, I think, first hearing been called upon to have all the trades in the industry go testify. That was very early on, and but I think that we were able to really explain and deliver the information that was needed at that time.
Yeah, you're right. In addition, and Rich just touches a little bit on your area, a lot of media contact and discussion about what did the storm mean? How do people handle their claims? A lot of questions about coverage. Since we don't typically get a lot of claims involving burst pipes, frozen pipes, there was a significant learning curve for consumers to understand what was the water damage coverage, but also just publicly with the media, explain, what do you do? Go look at your policy, what coverages are there. So ICT, as I recall, did 100+ media interviews and outreaches for a couple of months, just trying to help explain how all this worked. And I think the one lesson, at least I took away from it, and I know you're a veteran of the industry as well, but the lesson was that people don't really know oftentimes what's in their insurance policy.
Well, I think that's the big key. I think there was two things. One is just how widespread this was. This isn't a typical catastrophe or a peril that we're used to in Texas. In Texas, we're used to the hurricanes that impact, a relatively small portion of the state, maybe the coastal bend, the Houston area. We'll have tornadoes, but that's usually up north, towards Dallas, Fort Worth, maybe out in the panhandle a little bit. And, then hailstorms that'll impact, the vast majority of the state, but usually the impact isn't so widespread. So I think this was pretty eye-opening because the entire state was impacted by this. And it's not something that we're used to in Texas. Maybe you have it in the Midwest, up in Wisconsin and Michigan and the Northeast. But making those kind of ice and snow related claims, whether it was a burst pipe or roof damage due to ice dams, is a good opportunity for people to, and something that we try to do here at ICT is really educate the consumer on making sure that they have that proper coverage. And that's really what we were trying to do, is just, get the word out there to, to really look at your policy and make sure that you have that coverage and what is covered and what isn't. Some people have, the ALE or, food spoilage claims that they can make, and all of that was kind of new for a lot of people.
I do think going into this winter, and we're seeing it, it's not a session year, but there is more attention on that and who's responsible when something like the massive power outage that we did. I don't want to use the word unprecedented because we use it too much, but it does change. It does change the question.
Angie, interesting that you say the word "who's responsible," because as the lawyer in me likes to point out, there is somebody always responsible for a loss and a damage. And so there is a lawsuit that was filed into last year, into 2021, and it involved 130 plus insurance companies who have filed a subrogation action against ERCOT and energy producers over their alleged negligence and failure to weatherize and maintain the power grid. And this lawsuit, somewhat similar, as I understand it, to what happened in California a couple of years ago, involving the California Power Company and the wildfires out there. And so it'll be interesting to see where this goes. I know we've already gotten a lot of questions about that lawsuit, but it is, I'll use the word unprecedented here in Texas. It's a lawsuit, the first of its kind that I'm aware of, but it is the industry saying, we paid the claims that were due, we've taken care of our customers, but the reason that these water damage claims happened is not necessarily the cold only. It is because the power was out, because the power grid was not protected and ready to handle this storm. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. As with any litigation, you can expect years, a year or two at least, to see what happens with this. But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, and then what happens in the long run. And I'm hoping we do not have a repeat this year. I know it hadn't been that bad this year, but when it has gotten a little cold, immediately the thought goes to, I think my wife had me out wrapping the outdoor faucets just because it got into the 30s. So I think we're all a little shell shocked after last year, and I hope we don't have a repeat.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think your wife and you are a good example of what's going on with a consumer, is that I don't want to say trauma, but the lessons learned from last year, is that anxiety lays in of, as soon as you start to see those temperatures dip, boy, is this going to happen again? Is the state ready for it? Am I ready for it? We see things in the grocery stores. As soon as you see a weather forecast of, something that's going to dip down below, 39 degrees, it seems everything disappears from the grocery store shelves. And so that consumer anxiety will set in anytime something like this happens again, I think.
Yeah, completely agree. And, let us not forget, not to get into a weather discussion, but we still had numerous hailstorms and wind events throughout Texas last spring after the winter storm. So the industry was very busy with our quote normal severe weather events, but also the abnormal week-long freeze. So I do applaud everybody in the industry for everything that we did last year to help keep Texas going, deal with a record number of claims from this event, and make sure our customers are taken care of. Let's move back and talk a little bit about the legislature. I know we talked big picture what was going on, but in terms of the issues that matter to the property and casualty industry, Angie, you want to talk a little bit about some of those broad concepts or broad issues that came up repeatedly?
Yes, yeah, there was a couple of issues that were sort of at the forefront of what happened legislatively. And also, to put it in context too, I think it was an interesting session. As you said, there were a lot of new members and a new speaker and new committee members. And so we faced a House Insurance Committee that was really new to insurance. And so the issues that emerged and just the learning and the education, I think really colored, especially the beginning of the session. Of course, one of the big issues, which we talk about a lot, TWIA. There were many TWIA bills. And just sort of big picture, ICT, we tracked 430 bills. And then, so we had 63 PNC related bills, and then 17 that were significant, that we identified as significant. And a good portion of those were TWIA bills. There was a lot of discussion about rate increases and when the TWIA board can or cannot approve a rate, and also reinsurance, which also kind of led into a discussion about that. And I don't know if you have anything you want to interject on TWIA. It feels like everybody always TWIA, but
yeah, TWIA is the four-letter word that won't stop giving. Yeah, you're right. A lot of discussion on TWIA. I'm not going to get into great detail, but even discussion on how TWIA purchased its reinsurance, determined how to do its catastrophe modeling, and even the location of TWIA became an issue. An issue that actually,
yes.
it actually popped up in a special session as well. And so I know we talk a lot about TWIA, but it is always one of the key property and casualty issues, and particularly given the industry's $1 billion contingency, the liability there for TWIA. It's a big part of what companies have to look to or consider when doing business here in the state. I think you're right.
It's a complex problem that.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. As I say, it's not. We haven't created. It seems like there hasn't been legislation that's been able to sustain the years to where the problem's really fixed.
Yeah, it'll continue to occupy our time and our discussion. And I know there's only a couple of TWIA bills that actually passed. We ended up with 63 PNC related passing, but those stand out because they took a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of explaining over the lens of how it works and implications. A lot of discussion about auto repairs. This has been a recurring thing for at least 3-4 sessions about original OEM parts versus the use of aftermarket parts. Discussions about how consumers are directed or can be directed or discussed on how they get the repairs done. And we had a bill that would have actually required that if a car was under warranty, that only OEM parts be used. And so that took up a lot of time, backed by the Auto Dealers Association. And so a lot of discussion. And in May, as that bill was moving forward, Angie, you may recall, we actually learned of a study that was probably put out, I think, in early May or late April by the Federal Trade Commission that actually reviewed the use of requirement of OEM parts in warranty vehicles. And that study found that practice wasn't really, as I recall, needed. It was costly, and it was not a benefit to consumers at all. And so I know that's when that study came up, the industry quickly shared it and pointed out the problem with trying to mandate OEM parts without any real justification for it. So we expect to see that come up again. We expect to see auto bills dealing with how auto repair process is done. I think we had a bill regarding appraisal in auto policies, and so just a lot of interest in auto insurance in the state, particularly personal. On the commercial side, Angie, you know, we talked a lot about a bill. Yeah, House Bill 19 dealing with trucking litigation. And if you watch TV at all, I don't care what time of day you watch it, you'll see the lawyers advertising, have you been hit by a big rig? Because that became a very lucrative litigation factory. And so House Bill 19 was discussed and passed. And you want to talk a little bit about what that bill looks like it's intended to do?
Right. It's intended to change the structure, and you're the lawyer, so if I get this wrong, to try to prevent unnecessary litigation as far as commercial trucking goes. And then it does also have a study component where TDI is to look at these cases and then report back right before the next session in, I guess, like a year and a half. And so, but this was a big bill that was it was worked on with the Texans for Lawsuit Reform. There was a giant coalition and a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering, I think, to try to get this bill passed. And it's been probably a couple of sessions in the making, right? You think?
Yeah, at least, because I know the industry has seen increasing commercial auto rates just because of the litigation. It gotten so out of hand here in Texas. So it's been a big concern, and we'll see what this bill does. Hopefully it helps lessen the problem. But obviously, for those who need to file suit, it does provide them with an adequate remedy. The other big issue that took up a lot of time during session was on replacement cost. And how should replacement cost coverage be structured? How should it be paid? I think ultimately the bill that made it out of the House would have required 80% of replacement cost to be paid. It died in the Senate, but that discussion, correct me if I'm wrong, Angie, started back in 2020 after the October 2019 tornadoes and windstorms up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Right. It was the representative that brought up the bill had first brought the issue up at a hearing actually for TWIA. And so this was something that had been thought about during the interim. And I think that replacement costs, when we're looking at construction costs going up and things like that, I do think that it's going to continue to be an issue just because people are becoming more aware of it, and we could probably see some version of it be refiled this next session.
I think that's a really good point. As we see the costs, I mean, we're really looking at, looking back at 2021, and as we go into 2022, we're seeing inflation on almost everything. And so a lot of people are asking, we've had interest from media and consumer groups about the cost of insurance, but you have to, realize that the cost of insurance is directly related to the cost to repair or replace, whether it's an automobile or rebuild the home. And, a lot of people that you find is, I've been paying rates with my company for 20 years and never made a claim. But we always forget that insurance is such a team sport that, it's your rates and your premiums are based on what your neighbors are doing and what people in the area are doing, and that risk factor that insurance companies have to take on. And replacement costs and repair costs, the cost of wood increases, therefore the cost to build a home increases, and therefore that's more risk that your insurance company is taking on in order to insure you for the proper amount to rebuild or replace anything that might go wrong with your house. So I think there's going to be a lot of consumer interest and media interest moving forward in some of these and some of these actions that will be moving forward with through the legislature.
Yeah, Rich, thank you. I think you're exactly right. And without going into it too much, the recent fires in Colorado, have sparked similar discussions about replacement costs, underinsured property, and what should policies do or provide for to deal with that issue.
Yeah, we've been, not only Colorado, we've seen it, we saw it in California a couple of years ago when the wildfires came through, and really making sure that our member companies, that their customers are insured for the proper amount, and that consumers are aware that aware of their policy and aware of their coverage and repair and aware of their replacement costs to for their homes and even their autos.
Well, let's wrap up the Well, I don't want to say wrap up. You can never wrap up the Texas legislature.
Three special sessions later.
So, Angie, even after 140 days and nights, we still could not wrap up the legislature. 3 special sessions later this summer, thank God, no PNC issues were on the call, but we did see some issues that'll probably continue to show up in this year's campaigns, and perhaps even in next year's session. We don't really need to go into detail on those, but just recognize, the issues generally involved education, vaccines, and elections again. So expect to see more of the legislature moving forward, discussing this next year. In August,
those special sessions took us all the way through August, and then we had our first interim hearing.
Yeah, and guess what was on the agenda for the interim hearing? TWIA, one more time. So that hearing was interesting in and of itself, just generally the tone of it and the questions that arose. But of interest to us, there was a lot of questions about TWIA reinsurance, about what should TWIA's involvement be at the legislature, and then questions about a recent TWIA rate increase of 5%, and the legality, at least from some members' perspective, the legality of that 5% rate increase, and what it would mean for coastal homeowners. Now, to put that in perspective, that 5% rate increase, as we calculate it, means about $70 to $80 annually for the average TWIA policyholder. But a lot of concern by coastal members, which continued throughout the end of 21 about that rate increase. Actually, an effort in December of 2021 to overturn that rate increase at the TWIA board level. That did not happen, but it gave us a preview of the contentiousness and continued conflict over TWIA, particularly when it comes to rates, but also the larger question of how TWIA should be funded. And moving into,
I think also with that hearing, another thing that we saw with the dynamic of the members with the witnesses and lobbyists was, I think, their sentiment that they didn't want to hear from hired lobbyists, and they wanted to hear more from industry folks, in particular with regard to the insurance trades, was one thing that they very clearly vocalized during that hearing. And so I think that that's going to be interesting as we have more interim hearings, and then also going into the next session, just expectations and what that dynamic is going to be.
Yeah, TWIA will be with us when I'm retired. I think I've warned you whenever you get to retirement many years from now. Shortly thereafter, we have a new insurance commissioner appointed by Governor Abbott, Ms. Cassie Brown, who was formerly the Workers' Compensation Commissioner. And looking forward to working with Cassie. We've already had some discussions with her and her staff about where she's headed, but hopefully we'll hear more from our new insurance commissioner this year on her thoughts on the P&C industry. So I think that's enough on 2021. I'm sure we forgot something in there. It was a very busy year, but let's talk about where we're headed here in 2022. Like I said, we have a new insurance commissioner. The elections, primary elections, happen in March. So that is eating up a lot of the room as far as legislative issues. We do not anticipate having any interim hearings until after those primaries have concluded. One interim hearing of interest, again, involves TWIA There is a legislative oversight board that is looking at TWIA's funding structure moving forward. I know the industry will be involved in providing information on funding options. The industry has already discussed and presented some options that will hopefully move away from a TWIA funding system that's built on debt. But we'll see how those discussions go. I think one thing we're waiting for on that, Angie, if I'm correct, is some committee members to be appointed.
Right, we've got members appointed over in the House, but then we need Senate members appointed. Currently, I think statutorily, the only senator on there is Senator Schwartner, because he is the chair of Business and Commerce, which statute says that the chair of Business and Commerce should sit on that committee. And that also divulges into just how the dynamics and the players are going to change this year. I think it was late in the session and into the specials where the lieutenant governor shifted jurisdiction of insurance over to from Senate Business and Commerce, which had it for years and years and years, to jurisprudence. And so Senator Joan Huffman was the chair of jurisprudence, and she has now been appointed chair of finance. So we have somebody sitting on the TWIA Legislative Oversight Board with BNC, but from what we know, BNC is not going to handle property casualty issues. So we've got shuffling around, especially on the Senate side, and we will see where that lies. But again, I don't know if anything is going to really be shaped out until after the primaries. We've got 25 incumbents not coming back, and especially over in the Senate side, where we have Senator Larry Taylor, who has long been an insurance player and interested in insurance and TWIA issues. He's not running on the Senate side. Representative Mays Middleton from the House is running for his position. Senator Lucio, also, who's interested in coastal things. So there's going to be a lot of shifts. And over in the House, we have 3 former chairs of House Insurance that aren't running. And so we'll have lots of new faces.
Yeah, I agree. It's these primaries will be interesting. Obviously, there's statewide races going on, governors, attorney generals, lieutenant governor. But with the number of changes in the House, particularly with some folks who have some insurance background and experience, we can anticipate next session being a year where we're going to have to do a lot of education. We have not seen interim charges yet, which is the House Insurance and the Senate committee saying the issues they want to review related to PNC. So we'll wait and see what those are. I think we had a clue during session of what we can expect as some interim charges. One, as I recall, dealing with county mutuals.
Right.
And the other, Angie, do you recall what that was?
No, I believe that the county mutual issue, there may be some things on auto that I think have been maybe mentioned, but the county mutual issue was one that we have heard a couple of times that at least the House Insurance Chair will request, because they request and then it's ultimately up to the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker to decide what they're going to look into. And that usually happens November, December of the session year, and it's again, like we were talking about, probably going to be delayed until after March, just because everybody's focusing on the primaries.
Okay. Well, let's talk about other emerging issues, not necessarily legislative, but just industry in general. Rich touched upon this a little bit earlier as we talked about rising construction costs and the effect on homeowner rates, the impact of auto rates. You know, there were many companies did discounts during 2020 when driving frequency went down, accident frequency went down. But then as we return to normal in 2021, we are seeing companies, as they look at the increasing frequency and severity of losses on the auto side, making rate increase requests over TDI. And some of those have gotten a lot of public attention, but I think we'll continue to see increasing rate pressure on the auto side as well as the homeowner side. And so I think we kind of keep up with what's happening with that. I know Rich is working and answering questions from the media about why is that happening, and discussing the components or things that make up the auto rate and the homeowner rates. And what was the phrase you used, Rich?
That this is a team sport.
There you go. That, yes.
And yeah, and as we, this is happening in newsrooms, I think, and if it's happening in a newsroom, it's happening around the water cooler in offices or on, Zoom, with people, talking about it. They're, discussing their auto rates or their homeowners rates. And so, there are questions. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And the reason is everything is going up in cost. Whether it's lumber or copper wire or, just we've kind of talked about for the past couple of years, the cost to repair an automobile. A fender bender in 1995 is completely different than a fender bender now, whereas you had an aluminum chrome bumper in 1995, but now you have composites and 5 sensors and cameras, and so just the rising costs and those safety features that we love and we want in our cars, which are a good thing, but in the long run, we've seen that over the last couple of years having an impact on insurance rates because of that cost of repair.
Yeah, so it's a lot of education will need to be done, but we know we'll hear concerns about rates. But here's a great thing about the Texas market: there's a lot of companies, a lot of competition.
Yep. Shop
Shop around. If you're looking for a different rate, you can find one, and you should be able to find something that works for you. From an insurance company perspective, reinsurance costs are going up. And as we watch what's happened, we talked about the Texas disasters, but didn't even touch upon the various hurricanes that came through the U.S., the global disasters, and what impact those have had on the reinsurance market. And so I know we're hearing from a lot of our members about rising insurance costs and what they're having to do to adjust, and then the ripple down effect of that on reinsurance rates that consumers see. So interesting to keep up with what's happening there and how the reinsurance market is adjusting. But from what I understand, it's a very solid market. They have capital, are constantly having new capital brought in. So that bears watching. It's a trend we should keep track of this year. And something that I'm particularly interested in, the litigation that's happening over insurance issues. We spent the last couple of years talking about the business interruption litigation related to COVID. We touched on earlier the commercial trucking litigation that led to some new legislation, but we're seeing a variety of lawsuits regarding uninsured motorist claims and attorney's fees, as well as some of the excessive damage awards that we're seeing in litigation cases. And I know ICT has been involved in some briefing at the appellate level on these issues to try to help stem the tide of runaway litigation and excessive jury awards. So something else to keep an eye out for. A lot of mergers and acquisitions going on in the industry as well as at the agency level, and so that's changing the shape of our industry. Technology is always presenting new opportunities, but also new challenges as we try to meet our customers' needs, and just keeping up with Texas storms. As we touched on earlier, praying for no winter storm, but we know no matter what happens, we're going to have some hail and tornadoes and windstorms across the state, and probably some flooding that we typically get in the spring, particularly in the Houston area. So just keeping an eye out and being ready for that, and being ready to serve our market and keep our customers safe. Anything else that comes to mind that we need to remind our listeners to keep an eye out for this year in terms of the P&C industry?
Yeah, I think aside from what you already touched on, I think the inflation and that cost to repair and replace, I think our members and ICT need to be proactive and educate consumers and insurance customers on what that means to them, and that this isn't some kind of play to increase profits and things like that. That this is it's just it's really the cost of doing business, that the cost of everything is going up, and so that's going to impact insurance. And I think really keeping an eye on maybe 2 years down the road, but this ERCOT situation and how that's going to impact consumers. We've seen that in California with PG&E and the wildfires in 2018, and it really impacted that power company in PG&E in California, and and how does it impact the insurance consumer, and where those proceeds go, and what happens with the proceeds should the insurance industry come out kind of victorious on the end of that, and the and what they do with those proceeds after that suit. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in long term.
I would agree, Rich. I think it's going to be another interesting year, and I know Angie and I will be getting ready for legislative session, which will be here before you know it. For our members to keep up with all of the information we discussed, and we probably left out half of what we could be talking about just because there's so much that went on and can go on. But you can always follow us on our website, insurancecouncil.org, or download the ICT app. It's an excellent way to keep up with what's going on at TDI, at the Division of Workers' Compensation, and also at the Texas legislature. So keep up. Stay tuned. We'll do this periodically and update on key issues as we see them, but we thank you for joining us. I want to thank Angie and Rich for all their hard work and expertise, and for joining me today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of ICT on PNC. Find us online at insurancecouncil.org for more information about our organization or about the property and casualty insurance industry in Texas.